At my own retirement party, my son raised a glass and thanked everyone for trusting him with a company that was never his to begin with. The room erupted in applause before I could even take a breath. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above us, scattering warm light across a sea of smiling faces, colleagues, investors, people who had watched me build this company from nothing more than a folding table in my garage 32 years ago. I stood there in my navy silk dress, fingers wrapped around a champagne flute I hadn't touched, and I didn't interrupt. Daniel stood at the center of it all, confident, composed, his tailored suit fitting him like he had already stepped into a role he believed was rightfully his. "It's my company now," he said, with a small, almost humble smile, as if he were doing me a favor by saying it gently. A few people laughed, thinking it was a sentimental exaggeration, but then others began to clap, louder this time, more certain, as if they had just witnessed a natural passing of the torch. I watched their hands come together, one after another, the sound building into something that filled the entire ballroom, and I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance. And they were all part of the audience he had carefully prepared. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. He went on to thank the board for their continued confidence, thanked our senior leadership team for believing in the future, and even thanked his wife, Rebecca, who stood near the stage with a hand resting lightly on her waist, her expression composed but her eyes sharp, calculating. She met my gaze for half a second, just long enough for me to understand that this moment had not been spontaneous. It had been planned. Every word, every pause, every carefully timed smile. Around me, people nodded, murmured their approval, raised their glasses as if this transition had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. Someone behind me whispered, "He's ready," and another voice replied, "It's about time." I felt the weight of those words settle in the air, heavier than the champagne in my hand. About time. As if the years I had spent sacrificing weekends, missing holidays, signing personal guarantees when the company could barely stay afloat, had all been leading to this exact moment where I would quietly step aside while my son claimed ownership in front of a room full of witnesses. The band in the corner played softly, something upbeat, something entirely wrong for what was actually happening. Daniel lifted his glass one last time, his voice steady, "Here's to the future." And the room responded exactly the way he expected. Glasses raised. Smiles wide. Applause echoing again. I stood there, perfectly still, and let the sound wash over me. Because what none of them knew, what Daniel didn't know, what Rebecca certainly hadn't accounted for, was that I had already seen this coming long before tonight. And I had already made sure this story wouldn't end the way they thought it would. I set my glass down on the nearest table without taking a sip. The champagne had gone warm anyway, untouched since the moment Daniel first reached for the microphone. Around me, conversations resumed as if nothing unusual had happened, as if a son claiming ownership of his mother's life's work in front of 200 guests was simply part of the evening's entertainment. I could hear fragments of it drifting through the room. "He has been running things for a while now. She deserves to rest. It is good timing." I smiled politely when someone caught my eye, nodding as though I agreed, as though I had signed off on every word he had just said. Across the ballroom, Rebecca moved gracefully from group to group, her hand brushing lightly against Daniel's arm, her voice low and confident. She was not celebrating. She was confirming. Reinforcing the version of events they had already decided would become reality. I had noticed the shift months ago, though I had said nothing then either. Meetings I was not invited to. Documents summarized instead of shared. Decisions presented as updates rather than discussions. At first, I told myself it was natural. Daniel was stepping up. He was taking initiative. That was what I had prepared him for. But there had been moments, small ones, that did not sit right. The way he avoided specifics when I asked about financial projections. The way Rebecca began attending strategy sessions, not as a guest, but as someone who already belonged at the table. And then there were the emails. Threads forwarded too late. Attachments missing. Numbers that felt just slightly off, like a picture hung a few inches crooked on the wall. I did not confront him. I did not question her. I simply watched. The band shifted into a livelier tune, and a few couples drifted toward the dance floor, laughter rising again as if the tension I felt did not exist for anyone else. Daniel stepped down from the stage, immediately surrounded by board members and investors, all eager to congratulate him. He shook hands, accepted praise, nodded with practiced humility. I recognized that version of him. I had helped build it. But I also recognized something else now. Confidence that had not been earned in the way he believed. I turned slightly, just enough to catch the reflection of the room in the mirrored wall behind the bar. From there, I could see everything without being seen too closely myself. Rebecca leaned in toward one of our senior partners, speaking quietly, her expression assured. Daniel laughed at something someone said, already comfortable in a role he had not yet secured. And the applause from earlier still seemed to echo faintly in the back of my mind, like a decision that had already been made without me. I folded my hands together, steady, composed, the way I had learned to be in rooms like this long before Daniel ever attended his first board meeting. Because what they all mistook for acceptance was simply patience. And patience, I had learned over the years, was far more powerful than interruption. It had started quietly, the kind of change that could easily be mistaken for growth if you were not paying close attention. 3 days before the party, I had arrived at the office earlier than usual, just after 7 in the morning, when the building was still half asleep and the only sound came from the distant hum of the heating system. I liked those hours. They reminded me of the early years, when I would unlock the door myself, flip on the lights, and begin another day without knowing if we would make payroll by the end of the week. That morning, however, something felt different the moment I stepped into my office. My desk had been cleared more than I remembered. Not cleaned, not organized, but adjusted. Papers that I always kept within reach were stacked neatly to the side. A folder I had left open the night before was now closed, aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk as if someone had been careful not to leave a trace. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the back of my chair, and simply looked. It was a small thing. Easy to dismiss. But I had built an entire company by paying attention to small things. I sat down slowly and opened the top drawer. The documents I kept there were in order, but not in the way I had left them. Contracts shifted. Notes rearranged. Nothing missing. Nothing obvious. Just different enough to tell me that someone else had been there. I did not call security. I did not ask my assistant. Instead, I closed the drawer and turned on my computer, letting the screen light up the quiet room. My email inbox was already full, as it always was, but one thread caught my attention immediately. A message forwarded from Daniel, marked as informational, sent late the night before. I opened it and read carefully. It was a summary of a board discussion I had not attended. The tone was casual, almost dismissive, as if the decisions outlined inside had already been agreed upon by everyone who mattered. Strategic restructuring. Leadership transition. Future positioning. The language was polished, but the message underneath was clear. Plans were being made without me. I read it twice, then a third time, noting the names included in the thread, the ones who had replied, the ones who had remained silent. Rebecca's name appeared there as well, not as an observer, but as someone actively contributing. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle around me. Outside my office window, the city was beginning to wake, cars moving steadily along the street below, people hurrying toward buildings that depended on decisions like the ones being made without my knowledge. I did not feel surprised. Not entirely. There had been too many signs leading up to this moment. Too many conversations that ended just a second too quickly when I entered the room. Too many assurances that felt rehearsed instead of genuine. I closed the email and opened the company's internal system, navigating through files with the kind of familiarity that only comes from decades of use. Access logs. Document histories. Small details most people never think to check. I was not looking for proof. Not yet. I was looking for patterns. And what I found was enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. Changes had been made. Not large ones. Not obvious ones. But deliberate. Carefully timed. Carefully placed. I sat there for a long moment, hands resting lightly on the keyboard, and allowed myself a single quiet thought. They think I am stepping away. They think I am no longer watching. I closed the system without saving anything and reached for my phone, not to confront, not to accuse, but to make a call I had not planned to make until much later. Because if they were already moving pieces into place, then it was time for me to do the same. I stepped out of my office that morning with the same calm expression I had worn for years, the kind that reassured everyone around me that everything was under control, even when it was not. My assistant looked up from her desk and smiled, asking if I wanted my usual coffee, and I nodded as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface. That was the first rule I had learned in business long before Daniel ever sat in a boardroom chair. Never let them see the moment you realize something is wrong. I walked down the hallway slowly, past framed photographs that told the story everyone loved to repeat. The early days. The first contract. The first office space that was barely 800 square feet with mismatched chairs and a desk I bought secondhand. There was a photo of Daniel at 10 years old, sitting behind that same desk, pretending to run the company while I worked late into the night beside him. I paused there for just a second, not out of nostalgia, but to measure the distance between that boy and the man who had stood on a stage claiming everything I had built. The difference was not time. It was intention. By the time I reached the conference room, a few members of the leadership team were already inside, their voices lowering slightly when I entered, just enough for me to notice. They greeted me with the same polite respect they always had, but there was something underneath it now, something uncertain, as if they were no longer entirely sure where I stood in the structure they believed was already changing. I took my seat at the head of the table, the same seat I had occupied for decades, and opened my notebook without speaking. The meeting began, and I listened. Carefully. Patiently. Reports were presented. Numbers were discussed. Projections were outlined. But the details that mattered were not in what they said. They were in what they avoided. Certain topics were skimmed over too quickly. Certain decisions were referenced without context. And when I asked a question, simple and direct, the answers came with just enough hesitation to confirm what I already knew. Information was being filtered before it reached me. Not blocked entirely. That would have been too obvious. But adjusted. Controlled. After the meeting ended, Daniel did not linger the way he usually did. He gathered his things quickly, offered a brief smile, and said he had another call to get to. Rebecca followed him out, her posture relaxed, her confidence unshaken. I remained seated for a moment after the room had emptied, my fingers resting lightly on the closed notebook in front of me. The silence returned, thick and familiar, but it felt different now. Sharper. More defined. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was clarity. The kind that comes when all the small pieces finally align into something undeniable. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked back toward my office at the same steady pace. No rush. No hesitation. Just intention. When I closed the door behind me, I reached for the phone again, this time without any doubt. There were steps that needed to be taken. Quiet ones. Precise ones. Because if they believed the transition had already happened, then they had made their first mistake. And I intended to let them continue believing it for just a little while longer. The call was answered on the second ring, just as I expected. Margaret, John Peterson said, his voice steady, professional, but there was a pause before he continued, the kind that only happens when someone already knows the conversation is not going to be routine. John had been with the company almost as long as I had. He had seen the late nights, the near failures, the years when growth was not guaranteed and every decision carried weight. He was not easily surprised, and more importantly, he was not easily influenced. "I need to review something," I said, keeping my tone even, almost casual. "Ownership structure. Voting rights. Everything current, not summarized." There was a brief silence on the other end, not confusion, not hesitation, just calculation. "I can have that ready for you this afternoon," he replied. "No," I said gently. "I will come to you." Another pause, shorter this time. "Understood." I ended the call and sat back in my chair, letting my gaze drift across the office I had occupied for so many years. Every shelf, every file, every detail in that room existed because I had put it there. Not because someone handed it to me. Not because it was expected. But because I had built it, piece by piece, decision by decision. And yet, somewhere along the way, Daniel had begun to believe that proximity was the same as ownership. That standing close to something long enough made it his. I stood and reached for my coat, moving with the same measured pace I had maintained all morning. No urgency. No visible shift. As I walked through the office floor, a few employees greeted me, their smiles polite, their tone respectful, but there was something else now, something subtle but undeniable. They had heard the speech. They had seen the applause. And like most people, they were already adjusting to what they believed was the new reality. I acknowledged them all the same way I always had, with a nod, a brief word, nothing more, nothing less. By the time I reached John's office, he was already standing, a folder in his hands, his expression composed but attentive. He closed the door behind me without being asked, a small gesture that told me everything I needed to know. He understood the weight of this conversation. "You have seen it," he said quietly, not as a question. I set my bag down and took a seat across from him, folding my hands in my lap. "I have seen enough," I replied. He nodded once and opened the folder, turning it toward me. Documents. Charts. Legal summaries. Clean, precise, organized in a way that only someone like John would prepare. I looked at the first page, then the second, my eyes moving steadily, taking in every detail without rushing. Share distribution. Voting percentages. Trust agreements. Signatures. Dates. And there it was, exactly where I expected it to be, exactly as I had left it months ago when I made a decision no one else had been aware of. I felt something shift inside me then, not relief, not satisfaction, but confirmation. Quiet and absolute. I closed the folder slowly and met John's eyes. "Nothing has changed," I said. He shook his head once. "Nothing that gives him control," he confirmed. I nodded, standing up and smoothing the front of my coat as if this were just another meeting on a long list of meetings. "Good," I said simply. Because now I knew for certain. They had made their move. Public. Confident. Irreversible, in their minds. But they had done it without understanding the one thing that mattered most. And that was exactly where they had gone wrong. I left John's office without carrying the folder, without taking a single page with me, because I did not need to. The information was already where it needed to be, and more importantly, it was still exactly as I had arranged it months earlier when the first signs began to surface. Back then, it had not been obvious. Not to anyone else. But I had noticed the shift in tone, the subtle confidence in Daniel's voice when he spoke about decisions that had not yet been made, the way Rebecca started using language that implied ownership instead of support. That was when I made the adjustment. Quietly. Legally. Permanently. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, watching the numbers light up one by one as the doors closed. In the reflection of the polished steel, I saw the same composed expression I had worn all day, the same calm that people often mistook for acceptance. But there is a difference between stepping back and stepping aside, and I had never done the latter. When the elevator doors opened, the lobby was busy with the usual rhythm of midday movement, employees coming and going, conversations overlapping, the sound of footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Life continued as if nothing had changed, and in a way, it had not. The structure of the company remained intact. The authority remained exactly where it had always been. The only thing that had shifted was perception. And perception, I had learned, could be a dangerous thing when it went unchallenged for too long. I walked outside and paused for a moment on the sidewalk, the late afternoon air cool against my skin, grounding in a way the controlled environment of the office never was. Across the street, a group of younger employees stood laughing, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch a few words. "Did you hear the speech?" one of them said. "It makes sense," another replied. "He has been running things anyway." I did not turn toward them. I did not react. I simply listened for a second longer before continuing toward my car. That was the narrative now. Clean. Simple. Convenient. A son stepping into leadership while his mother retired gracefully. It was a story people understood, one they could accept without asking questions. And that was exactly why Daniel had chosen the stage, the timing, the audience. Because once people believe they have witnessed a transition, they stop looking for proof. I opened the car door and sat inside, placing my hands lightly on the steering wheel without starting the engine. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to think back to the day I signed the documents that secured everything in a way no one else had anticipated. Not out of fear. Not out of suspicion. But out of experience. I had seen too many businesses fall apart because control was assumed instead of protected. I had built safeguards not against strangers, but against uncertainty itself. And now, those safeguards were about to matter more than anyone in that ballroom could imagine. I started the engine and pulled out into the flow of traffic, blending seamlessly into the city that had watched me build something from nothing. Behind me, the company continued to operate under the illusion that a change had already taken place. Ahead of me, there was only one thing left to do. Wait for the right moment to let that illusion collapse on its own.